Long before modern cities covered the earth, before written history, before laboratories and pharmacies, humans were already learning the secrets of the natural world. They watched animals eat certain plants. They noticed which leaves could be woven into strong fibers. They discovered which roots could soothe pain, which seeds could provide nourishment, and which plants could alter the way the human mind experienced the world. Among these ancient plants was cannabis. Today, cannabis is surrounded by debate, politics, medicine, culture, and controversy, but its story is far older than any modern argument. Its history reaches back thousands of years into a time when humans lived in small communities across the vast landscapes of Eurasia. And that raises a fascinating question. When did humans first discover cannabis? The honest answer is surprisingly difficult. There was no single moment when someone suddenly discovered the plant. Instead, cannabis slowly became part of human civilization. People learned how to grow it. They learned how to make fibers from its stems. They discovered its seeds could be useful. And at some point, different communities also learned that certain varieties could affect the mind. But who was first? Was it a hunter wandering across the grasslands of ancient Central Asia? A farmer experimenting with wild plants? A healer searching for useful medicines? Or perhaps someone simply noticed that animals behaved differently after eating the plant? We may never know. What we do know is that cannabis has one of the oldest relationships with humanity among cultivated plants, and its story begins thousands of years ago. Imagine Central Asia thousands of years ago. There are no highways, no modern borders, no large cities, only enormous grasslands, forests, rivers, mountains, and scattered human settlements. Communities survived by hunting, gathering, farming, and trading. Plants are not simply scenery, they are food, medicine, clothing, rope, fuel, and sometimes something much more mysterious. Wild cannabis plants likely existed across parts of Eurasia long before humans began deliberately cultivating them. The plant itself was remarkably useful. Its strong stalks could provide tough fibers. Its seeds contained valuable nutrients, and different cannabis populations developed different characteristics depending on their environment. Over generations, humans began selecting plants that were especially useful. This process changed cannabis. The wild plant gradually became a cultivated resource, and this is an important distinction. Humans did not necessarily discover cannabis in the way we think of discovering something new. They encountered it, they experimented with it, and eventually they learned how to use it. That process could have taken generations. Because written records did not exist in most of the world during this early period, historians must rely heavily on archaeology. Archaeologists examine seeds, fibers, pottery, tools, burial sites, and traces of plants preserved in ancient materials. Sometimes even microscopic chemical residues can provide clues. One of the most important regions in the early history of cannabis is Central and East Asia. Evidence suggests that humans were interacting with cannabis thousands of years ago, particularly for its fiber and seeds. But determining exactly when people first used cannabis for its psychoactive effects is much harder. This is where the mystery deepens. A piece of hemp rope can tell us that people used the plant for fiber. Cannabis seeds can tell us that people collected or cultivated it. But neither necessarily proves that people deliberately consumed it for its intoxicating effects. Scientists therefore have to look for other evidence: ancient containers, burned plant material, chemical residues, burial sites, and written descriptions from later civilizations. Each discovery adds another piece to the puzzle, but the puzzle remains incomplete. As agriculture expanded across Eurasia, humans began deliberately cultivating useful plants: wheat, barley, millet, flax, and eventually cannabis became another valuable crop in some regions. The importance of hemp should not be underestimated. Its fibers were exceptionally useful. People could twist them into ropes. They could weave them into textiles. They could use them for nets and other practical objects. For ancient communities, a plant that could provide strong fiber was extremely valuable. But cannabis had another useful feature. Its seeds could be eaten. They contain oils and nutrients that made them useful as food. So even without any interest in its psychoactive properties, cannabis could already play an important role in everyday life. This may have been the foundation of its long relationship with humanity. First, people recognized the practical plant. Then, over centuries, they discovered its other properties. At some point in ancient history, humans discovered that certain cannabis plants could produce noticeable changes in consciousness. Exactly when this happened remains uncertain. Some of the earliest strong evidence comes from ancient Central Asian archaeological contexts. Researchers have discovered evidence suggesting that cannabis was burned or used in ritual settings thousands of years ago. One particularly fascinating area is the ancient region of the Pamirs and surrounding Central Asian landscapes. These were places where cultures, technologies, and ideas traveled across enormous distances. People buried their dead with objects they considered important. They traveled with animals, they traded materials, and they may also have carried plants. In some ancient burial contexts, researchers have found evidence associated with cannabis burning. This suggests that cannabis may have been used not only as a material resource, but also in ritual or ceremonial practices. Perhaps its smoke was considered spiritually significant. Perhaps it was connected with funerary ceremonies. Or perhaps people simply discovered its effects and incorporated them into existing traditions. The evidence does not give us every answer, but it gives us something remarkable, a glimpse into a world where plants could occupy the boundary between medicine, ritual, and everyday life. Long before modern pharmacology, medicine was deeply connected to plants. Ancient healers observed nature carefully. They prepared leaves, roots, seeds, oils, and extracts. Some treatments were effective, others were based on beliefs that modern science does not support. Cannabis eventually became part of this ancient medicinal world. In historical Chinese sources, cannabis appears in discussions of medicinal plants. Traditional Chinese medicine developed sophisticated systems of herbal knowledge, and cannabis was among the plants that received attention. But we should be careful when interpreting ancient medical texts. A plant mentioned in an ancient medical tradition does not automatically mean that ancient physicians understood its chemistry or effects in the way modern scientists do. Their understanding was based on observation, tradition, and the medical theories of their time. Still, the survival of cannabis in these records tells us something important. By ancient historical periods, people were no longer simply encountering cannabis in the wild. They were studying it, using it, and incorporating it into organized systems of knowledge. Now imagine the ancient trade routes connecting east and west. Caravans move across deserts. Merchants travel through mountain passes. Languages mix. Religions travel. Technologies spread. And plants travel too. The famous Silk Road was not a single road. It was a network of routes connecting distant regions of Eurasia. Along these routes, people exchanged silk, spices, metals, textiles, horses, medicines, and countless other goods. Cannabis could travel through these same networks. As people moved, they carried seeds. They introduced crops to new environments. They exchanged knowledge about useful plants. And over time, cannabis became familiar across a much wider geographic area. Its story was no longer limited to one region. Different societies began developing their own traditions surrounding it. Some emphasized hemp fiber, some valued its seeds, some used it medicinally. Others associated it with ritual or altered states of consciousness. The same plant could have completely different meanings depending on the culture. When most people hear the word cannabis, they immediately think about its psychoactive effects. But for much of human history, another part of the plant may have been even more important: hemp fiber.
Strong, natural fibers were essential before the industrial age. Rope was needed for boats. Nets were needed for fishing. Clothing required durable fibers. Agricultural communities needed cords and woven materials, and hemp could provide all of these. For ancient and medieval societies, this was not simply a recreational curiosity. It was an agricultural resource, a practical material, something that could contribute directly to survival. This is why the history of cannabis cannot simply be reduced to the history of an intoxicating substance. For thousands of years, cannabis and hemp were part of agriculture, manufacturing, medicine, trade, and daily life. The modern distinction between hemp and cannabis can sometimes make the ancient story seem more complicated than it actually was. Ancient people were dealing with a diverse group of plants and varieties. Their priorities were practical. What could this plant do? Could it feed us? Could it clothe us? Could it help us? Could it be used in a ceremony? These were the questions that mattered. As civilizations expanded, cannabis continued moving. It eventually became established across large parts of Europe and later reached other regions through trade, migration, agriculture, and global exploration. Different societies adopted it for different purposes. In some places, hemp became an important industrial crop. In others, preparations containing cannabis became part of traditional medicine. And in some cultures, psychoactive cannabis became associated with spiritual or social practices. This diversity is one of the most fascinating aspects of its history. There was never one universal cannabis culture. There were many, each shaped by local beliefs, local agriculture, available varieties, and historical circumstances.
By the 19th century, cannabis had entered Western medical discussions more prominently. Researchers and physicians began studying preparations derived from the plant, but the modern story soon became complicated. During the 20th century, governments in many countries introduced increasingly strict controls on cannabis and related substances. Political campaigns, social fears, international treaties, and changing ideas about drugs transformed the legal status of cannabis. A plant with thousands of years of human history suddenly became associated primarily with prohibition. The transformation was dramatic. For ancient farmers, cannabis could be rope. For ancient healers, it could be medicine. For some ritual communities, it could have spiritual significance. For modern governments, it increasingly became a controlled substance. The plant had not changed nearly as much as humanity's relationship with it. There is another important question. When ancient humans first used cannabis, did they understand what they were doing? Probably not in the modern scientific sense. They did not know about cannabinoids. They did not know about THC. They did not understand receptors in the human brain. They did not have modern chemistry. Instead, they relied on observation. They learned through experience. A healer might notice that a particular preparation produced a certain effect. A craftsperson might discover that the stalks produced excellent fiber. A farmer might notice that some plants grew differently. A ritual specialist might recognize that burning certain plants changed the atmosphere of a ceremony. Knowledge accumulated slowly. One generation passed observations to the next, and eventually these observations became traditions. That may be how much of humanity's early plant knowledge developed, not through laboratories, but through thousands of small experiments conducted by ordinary people. And now we return to the original question. When did humans first discover cannabis? There is no single date. The evidence suggests that humans were interacting with cannabis thousands of years ago, particularly in Central and East Asia. Its use as a fiber crop appears to be extremely ancient. Evidence for medicinal and ritual use emerges in later archaeological and historical records, and evidence for deliberate psychoactive use is especially difficult to date precisely. That means the true answer may remain hidden. Perhaps someone encountered wild cannabis more than 10,000 years ago. Perhaps a hunter noticed its unusual properties. Perhaps an early farmer began cultivating it without understanding its full potential.
Or perhaps the first person to discover its psychoactive effects was simply experimenting with a plant growing nearby. We will probably never know that person's name, but we know something much more important. The relationship between humans and cannabis is ancient, far older than modern politics, far older than modern drug laws, far older than the words we use to describe the plant today. Think about that for a moment. Thousands of years ago, somewhere across the enormous landscapes of Eurasia, a human being encountered a cannabis plant. There were no cameras, no written journals, no scientific papers. No one recorded the moment. Yet that tiny encounter may have been the beginning of a relationship that would eventually stretch across continents and thousands of years. Humans learned to cultivate the plant. They transformed its fibers into useful materials. They consumed its seeds. They experimented with its medicinal properties. They incorporated it into traditions. They traded it across enormous distances, and eventually they built laws and controversies around it. The history of cannabis is therefore not simply the history of a plant. It is the history of human curiosity. It is the story of how people observe nature, experiment with it, learn from it, and sometimes transform it completely. And perhaps the most fascinating part is that the first chapter of this story may never be known. Somewhere in the distant past, before recorded history began, humans and cannabis first crossed paths. We don't know exactly where, we don't know exactly when, and we don't know who made the first discovery. But thousands of years later, that encounter is still shaping the world. And that is what makes the ancient history of cannabis so fascinating. Because sometimes the most important discoveries in human history begin with something incredibly simple: a person.